There is something historians rarely say directly about Babylon. Not because they do not understand it, but because once you see it clearly, it changes how you interpret power itself. Babylon did not simply fall like most cities in history. Instead, it exposed a pattern that continues to shape how systems rise and collapse even today. What makes this unsettling is that, at its peak, Babylon did not appear weak, unstable, or even close to decline. From the outside, it looked complete, dominant, and untouchable. And yet that was precisely the moment it had already begun to break beneath the surface. Most people approach Babylon as a finished story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, something distant and safely contained in the past. However, people who pay closer attention begin to notice that Babylon did not disappear in the way we expect fallen empires to disappear. It evolved into a blueprint, and that blueprint continues to repeat itself across different eras in ways that are not always immediately visible. Babylon did not begin as a dominant force, or a city destined for greatness. It was one of many small settlements scattered across Mesopotamia, surrounded by stronger rivals, unstable alliances, and constant uncertainty. If you were living at that time, there would have been nothing about Babylon that suggested it would one day define history. That lack of attention was not a weakness, it was an advantage. Babylon's early success did not come from strength or wealth, but from positioning. It sat between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, exactly where trade routes, ideas, and movement naturally flowed. Instead of forcing expansion, Babylon absorbed what passed through it, quietly accumulating influence over time. This is the first principle that most people overlook, because power does not always begin by dominating. In many cases, it begins by placing itself where dominance eventually becomes unavoidable. Babylon did not rush to conquer, it allowed itself to become necessary. However, positioning alone is never enough to sustain long-term power. Many cities had access to trade and resources, yet most of them disappeared. Babylon made a second move that changed everything, and that was structure. This is where Hammurabi enters the story, not simply as a ruler, but as someone who understood timing better than most leaders of his era. Instead of expanding first, he focused on control. He built internal order, administrative clarity, and predictable systems before attempting to extend his reach outward. Once that foundation was stable, expansion became efficient and calculated rather than chaotic. Territory was not taken randomly, but acquired at the right moments, when conditions were favorable and resistance was manageable. However, the true turning point was not the expansion itself, but the system that supported it. Hammurabi's code is often remembered for its harsh punishments, but its real significance was the clarity it introduced. For the first time at that scale, people understood the rules that governed them and the consequences of their actions. When individuals understand a system, they behave more predictably, and predictability creates control. Control, in turn, allows systems to scale. This was the moment Babylon stopped being just another city and became a model. Once something becomes a model, it does not remain contained. It spreads. Babylon's influence moved beyond its borders, not only through physical expansion, but through the way its system was perceived and understood. It became a reference point, a standard that others recognized and reacted to. With that recognition came attention, and attention inevitably changes perception. Babylon was no longer just growing, it was being described, discussed, and increasingly exaggerated. Its wealth became legendary, its architecture seemed almost unreal, and its achievements were amplified beyond their actual scale. At this stage, something subtle but critical began to happen. Perception started to grow faster than reality, and when that gap forms, systems begin to drift. The Hanging Gardens are a perfect example of this phenomenon. They are often described as one of the wonders of the ancient world. Yet there is no definitive proof that they existed in the way they are commonly portrayed. What matters is not whether they were real, but why people believed they were. The idea that Babylon could create something so extraordinary felt believable because of its reputation. Once a system is seen as capable of exceeding natural limits, people stop questioning it. That is when blind spots begin to form. This is where more perceptive observers start to recognize a pattern, because history shows that systems rarely collapse when they appear weak. Instead, they tend to collapse when they are widely believed to be untouchable. Babylon reached that phase under Nebuchadnezzar II, when everything about the city projected dominance. Massive walls, advanced infrastructure, and monumental structures were not just functional, they were designed to influence perception. The Ishtar Gate, for example, was not merely an entrance, but a psychological statement that communicated power to anyone who approached it. From the outside, Babylon appeared stable, controlled, and complete. However, This is exactly where most people stop looking, because nothing seems to be wrong. In reality, this is often the moment when internal pressure begins to build. Maintaining dominance at that scale requires constant alignment across leadership, administration, and social structure. Over time, that alignment becomes harder to sustain, and small inconsistencies begin to appear. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, there was no sudden collapse or dramatic turning point. The city continued to function, the structures remained intact, and the image of power persisted. This is what makes this phase so dangerous, because decline did not look like failure, it looked like continuity. Beneath the surface, however, leadership became less consistent, coordination weakened, and internal unity started to fragment. The external image of strength remained, but the internal system was no longer functioning in the same way. Most people fail to recognize this stage, because they are conditioned to expect collapse to be visible and immediate. In reality, collapse often begins long before it can be seen. This is the point at which the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, enters the story. Contrary to what many would expect, Babylon did not fall through a massive, destructive battle. Instead, it fell with minimal resistance, which raises an important question. How does a city that powerful collapse so quietly? The answer is not comfortable, because it suggests that the weakness was not external but internal. Cyrus did not destroy Babylon's strength. He exposed the fact that it was no longer functioning as a unified system. The defenses were still present, and the structures were still intact, but the coordination behind them had deteriorated. When a system loses alignment, its visible strength becomes irrelevant. This is the moment that fundamentally changes how Babylon should be understood. It did not fall because it was attacked. It fell because it had already begun to break internally. The external event simply revealed what was already happening beneath the surface. After this transition, Babylon did not disappear immediately. It continued to exist, but it no longer controlled its own direction. It became part of a larger empire, and once autonomy is lost, decline becomes a gradual process rather than a single event. Over time, its importance diminished as trade routes shifted, power centers moved, and attention relocated elsewhere. Babylon slowly transitioned from central to secondary, and eventually to symbolic. This transformation into a symbol is what makes Babylon unique. It did not simply fade into obscurity. It took on a new role in human thought. In religious texts and cultural narratives, Babylon came to represent excess, corruption, and the dangers of unchecked power. It became less of a place and more of a warning, a concept used to describe systems that grow too large and lose balance. What makes this especially significant is that ideas do not remain confined to the past. They persist, adapt, and reappear in new contexts. Even today, the term Babylon is used to describe systems that feel too powerful, too complex, or too disconnected to fail. Most people use it without fully understanding its origins, but the pattern it represents remains consistent. This leads to a more important question, which is not what happened to Babylon, but why its pattern continues to appear. When you break it down, the structure is remarkably consistent. A system rises through strategic positioning, stabilizes through structure, expands through perception, reaches dominance, and then gradually disconnects from reality. Once that disconnect occurs, decline becomes inevitable, even if it is not immediately visible. Most people look at history as a collection of events, but those who study it more closely begin to see patterns. Babylon is not significant because of what happened in the past. It is significant because of what it reveals about how systems behave over time. Once you understand that, you begin to notice similar structures, appearing in different forms across different periods. This creates a question that is difficult to ignore, because it does not stay confined to history. It extends into the present. Every dominant system believes it is stable, and every powerful structure assumes it is sustainable. From within, the peak always feels permanent. However, history suggests that this perception is often misleading. Babylon did not fail because it lacked power. It failed because its internal reality no longer matched its external image. When that gap appears, collapse is not immediate, but it becomes unavoidable. This is the deeper legacy of Babylon, not its architecture or its wealth, but the pattern it revealed. It is a pattern that does not announce itself or provide clear warnings. It does not appear dramatic while it is happening, and that is precisely why it is so easy to miss. However, once you recognize it, it becomes difficult to ignore. Babylon stands apart from other fallen cities because it did not simply disappear. It became a lens through which we can understand the rise and decline of power itself. Cities collapse and empires fade, but ideas operate differently. They adapt, spread, and reappear in new forms across time. In that sense, Babylon never truly left. It changed form and continued to exist in the patterns it revealed. And if you pay close enough attention, you begin to realize that this is not just a story about the past, it is something that continues to unfold. And the only real question is whether we recognize it while it is happening, or only after it is too late.